So in this meeting, what we're going to do is I'm going to have each of the MPs speak for about 10 minutes. They're going to just talk to you about why they support PR, what they see as some realistic things that we can work on together in this upcoming parliament, and what citizens can do to support that work. So I will start with, I'll start with Daniel Blakey. We're going to go alphabetical. So I'll ask the other panelists to turn off their webcam and mic while Daniel and myself as well, while Daniel is talking, and it's over to you. Oh, Daniel. So I will introduce you. And I'm doing short introductions as well, guys. Sorry. So first elected as the MP for Elmwood Transcona in 2015, Daniel has served in a number of positions, including the NDP caucus chair. He currently occupies several roles in the NDP, international trade critic, critic for employment, workforce development and disability inclusion, and democratic reform critic. So hopefully that's all right. Got it right off Daniel's website. He is a longtime advocate for PR. He was involved in Fairvote's local chapter before he got into politics. So that's how far back his passion for electoral reform goes. Daniel was appointed as the NDP's Democratic Reform Critic in 2019 and again in this parliament. So in June 2021, the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, which we'll be referring to as the PROC Committee, passed Daniel's motion to study a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. And Wayne Long was actually there that day and voted for that motion. So Fair Vote Canada campaigned hard for that motion to pass. We were thrilled to see it passed. And the study of a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform would be proceeding right about now if we hadn't had an early election. So Daniel is committed to working to get this motion passed again by a newly formed PROC committee. And with that, I will turn it over to Daniel.
Right on. Well, thanks so much, Anita. And thanks for everybody who's taking time today to participate in this conversation and talk about how we move the conversation forward on electoral reform here in Canada. I mean, I think if you're in this room, you probably have a pretty good idea as to some of the important reasons why we need our voting system to change, but I'll maybe just run through a couple of what I take to be the big ones, and then talk a little bit about the process in this parliament. So first of all, I think one of the things that's important to remind ourselves of is that if you look at Canada in the 21st century, we're almost 22 years in, and we've only had 3 majority governments. We had a majority government from 2000 to 2003, 2004. We had a majority government from 2011 to 2015, and a majority government from 2015 to 2019. So all told, only about half the years in this century have been under majority government, and less than half of the elections have produced a majority parliament. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing, because I don't think that minority parliaments are a bad thing. But there is sometimes in the conversation around electoral reform a kind of prejudice that suggests that somehow majority parliaments are the norm in Canada, and that anything that would disrupt the norm would cause dysfunction. And so if we end up with minority governments, it will be dysfunctional. Therefore, we should have a system that promotes majority governments. Except even on the facts, our system doesn't produce majority governments all the time, particularly not when Canadians are divided and are having a reasonable conversation about a bunch of different points of view. That's actually been just as much the norm in 21st century Canada as it has been for majority government. So I think that's an important reminder. Then I think if you look particularly at the pandemic years, I think we've seen that when the country's in crisis, as it has been, both in respect to the pandemic and more in respect to the climate crisis that we're facing down as a country and as a world, a minority parliament has actually managed to come together around the important items. And if not everyone all the time together, although sometimes, then certainly certain parties within Parliament have been able to work together in order to accomplish some pretty important things and some pretty sweeping changes to the way that we do things. And so not only have Canadians often chosen in the 21st century to have minority parliaments, but we've also shown that in the face of incredible challenge, minority parliaments are able to rise to the occasion and allow governments to act decisively when it's really warranted. So all that to say, wouldn't it make more sense to have an electoral system that allows Canadians to see their political preferences better represented in Parliament? And of course, one of the things we often hear from Canadians too is that they want to see political parties and members of Parliament from various political parties work better together. And I think that's easier when you don't have the possibility of a snap election and a new majority government hanging over everybody's head, including the possibility open for the government and for the prime minister. And we saw just this summer how tempting it can be for a prime minister who's riding a little higher in the polls to decide that it's time to fold up Parliament, have an election, and then hope to come out on that other side with a majority and not have to do the kind of good faith negotiating that a well-functioning minority parliament requires. So we've just had a recent example too of how hanging on to the first past the post system creates perverse incentives for political actors to go ahead and do things that defy the public interest in the name of a private political interest. So that's another reason why it would make sense to change the parliament. It would get rid of those disincentives to collapse parliaments early when it's not in the public interest. And I think it would also cause, it has the potential for some structural change. I don't think it's going to end, all of the things that people don't like about politics, obviously. And I think if you look at places where they have proportional systems, there's still politics and there's still things that people don't like about politics. But I think it would help create a sense that, hey, you know what, if we're going to go to an election and the outcome is going to be far more proportional to the way that people actually vote in terms of how many seats each party gets, then probably we're going to end up coming back with a parliament that looks a lot like the last one. Maybe there'll be a few more seats here or a few less seats there, but largely it's going to be the same. So why don't we just work it out now? Why don't we try and find a way to work together now and avoid elections that people don't necessarily want to have, as was the case in the last one, and forge a path forward together. So I think it makes sense from that point of view. And the last thing I'm going to touch on in the little bit of time I have remaining is just the importance of getting, Canada is such a huge country. And if there's anything that I thought I knew that has been made even more clear to me and impressed upon me even more so in the little over 6 years now that I've had the honor of being a member of parliament, is just how big Canada is and how many different regions we have, and the genuine and legitimate political differences that manifest when people are from different parts of a really huge territory. And so having those different voices at each caucus table, I think it's not a difference that you would see because of course caucus meetings are private, but I think, but you need to know how important those conversations are and how important it can be to have that voice at the table when parties are formulating their position on a given issue of the day, for someone to be able to speak up from each region of the country and say, well, I respect that that's how you see it from BC, say, but if you're from Manitoba, or if you're from PEI, or if you're from Nunavut, it could be a very different take on that issue. And so having more of those regional voices around the table is something that I think would improve caucus conversations and actually help undercut some of the kind of factionalism that the first past the post system helps create in Canada. We often hear critics of proportional representation talk about factionalism as one of the downsides. But the fact is that our first past the post system does it in a regional way. And so you have a very explicitly regionally based party for Quebec. You have the Conservative Party, which is still dominated in many ways by the Reform movement, which was largely a Western Canadian movement, and arguably, I think sometimes you have the Liberal Party, which has been, if you look at some of the outcomes of the Chrétien era, and even now, kind of Ontario regional party because they get the lion's share of their seats for government from Ontario, and other parties don't necessarily get a lot of seats in Ontario. Depending on the election, there's been more or less, but there were times in the Chrétien era where a lot of folks, where virtually all of the MPs from Ontario were Liberal. And so you do get a kind of regionalism within the first past the post system. And I think having more regional diversity at the caucus tables, particularly for smaller caucuses, is a good thing, and would help us advance some important national conversations in a better way. Because you'd be hashing out some of those regional differences at caucus meetings in the context of being on the same team, instead of allowing those regional differences to become partisan differences. And I think that would be a healthy thing. So that's just a little overview of some of the things, some of the reasons why I think proportional representation is important. Anita mentioned I worked with Fair Vote to bring a motion to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee last Parliament, because we thought, given that there wasn't government support for moving that conversation forward anymore, that it was important to try and find a path. And I thought that was the best path available. And my colleague Rachel Blaikie, who's on the Procedure and House Affairs Committee in this Parliament, has already given notice of that motion, and we'll be looking to move it as soon as we think we can, and hope and get it with some success of having it actually get studied and report back to the House on what a path forward would look like. So I look forward to speaking a little bit more about that process in the question and answer period, but don't want to take up an undue amount of time. So thank you, Anita, for your patience, and thanks to everybody for listening.
Thank you, Daniel. That was great. I just wanted to reinforce a few things that Daniel said. I read something recently that said, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And that sort of came to mind when Daniel was talking about the advantages that we would see if we had multiple parties working together more behind the scenes to hear concerns from different perspectives and concerns from across the country. So thank you very much, Daniel, for all your work on this file. Now I am going to introduce Wayne Long. There he is. Okay, so Wayne was first elected as the MP for St. John Rothesay in 2015. So same election that Daniel was elected in 2017. This I got off Wikipedia. I found this fascinating, and I only vaguely remembered it, that Wayne voted against the Liberal Party and for around the issue of tax changes for small businesses. And this has sort of been a pattern that we've seen of Wayne speaking up for his local constituents, whether or not it goes along with the party line. And I think there's a lot of people on this webinar today that probably appreciate that. And right after the 2019 election, Wayne came to our attention because he spoke out in the media about the need for electoral reform. And I don't think there was a lot of people, particularly Liberal or Conservative MPs, going in the media saying, wow, this is a real problem right after the 2019 election. Wayne was on the Procedure and House Affairs Committee in the last Parliament and voted yes, along with his Liberal colleagues, to study the motion, to study the National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. During the 2021 election, Wayne ran on a personal commitment to work on this issue and related issues. And he said that his constituents are tired of old style party first politics, and he has committed to reintroducing the motion. Working with Daniel, however they do that, to advance a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform at the committee, introducing a Democratic Reform Act designed to rein in party discipline, empower individual members of Parliament, bring increased transparency and accountability to federal caucuses and leadership structures. Wow, that's a no small task. And establishing ambition, establishing an all-party electoral reform caucus to advocate for the introduction of PR at the federal level. So we are really excited to have Wayne join us on a Fair Vote Canada webinar, and I will turn it over to Wayne, and he may want to mention something about the Sea Dogs that I didn't cover.
Well, Daniel and I always have this joke that I was the former owner and president of the St. John Sea Dogs, which is a major junior hockey club, and been across Canada, obviously, whether it's the WHL, OHL, or Quebec Major Junior. A lot of us have major junior clubs in our riding. So I was president part owner. We won the Memorial Cup in 2011. It's always been a source of pride. So, Anita, thank you for letting me come on and speak to you all today from coast to coast to coast. I certainly want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqey people. And I'm privileged and honored to be here to speak to you. And I come at it, I think from a little bit of a different lens. I am, sitting in government, as a member of the Liberal Party. And I'll share my experience with you. I ran in 2015, like Anita said, and certainly was a part of the government that talked about electoral reform. And, we certainly all know too well that, our prime minister said that this would be the last election with first past the post system. And, I thought that that's what would happen. So obviously, a committee was formed, went across the country, came back, and sadly, we didn't move forward with that promise, and we broke that promise. And I'll be perfectly transparent. I've learned as I've gone along. I didn't grow up in politics. I don't really even consider myself an overly political person. I was a business guy, viewed politics basically at a distance. And when we didn't commit to moving forward, I was, to be blunt, somewhat indifferent. I didn't want to see us break a promise, but also at that point, now let's go back, that was, 6 years ago, I was kind of like, well, first past the post, a lot of people tell me that it's okay, there's not consensus and so on and so forth. So obviously that happened. But, from that moment on, I'll be honest, I did more research. I learned more. I saw obviously the disappointment that, I have two sons in their 20s. And, I started to talk more to younger people involved in our political system. And I saw the disengagement, the disappointment, how in particular, the youth of our country aren't engaged at all with politics or the political system. And, you talk to youth and you ask why, and they're like, look, my vote doesn't count. I don't feel represented. I'm tired of the same old liberal to conservative, back to liberal to conservative, conservative, liberal, liberal. And, our system is broken. And we need to do better. And we need to have a system where people feel their vote counts and that they're representative. And I mean, you certainly look at countries like New Zealand, Germany, that have, proportional representation systems. They work well. They work very well. And, the MMP system, which is basically, I guess I would call it somewhat of a hybrid where, a typical voter would have two votes. So they would have one vote for the representative that they want, like now, but then they'd have another vote to vote for the party that they would want. And, obviously that would allow for a better representation across the country. And, what I see with proportional representation in particular, it builds collaboration and consensus into the system. You've got to work together. And like Daniel said, we've only had very few majority governments across the country, and minority governments can work when parties work together. There's no question that a minority government, obviously, again, as Daniel has said, is shown, especially through the pandemic, that when we do work together, good things can happen. We can, have good debate. We can change some of our policies to get more consensus across the board. And I believe this. We can go back and talk about 2015 and the promise and promise was broken. But let's talk reality. Here's where we are right now. We're in a situation where we have a minority government, and we have a situation where us as the Liberal Party need to work with other parties. I was a part of PROC, temporarily for a better part of probably 4 or 5 months, it seemed, when Daniel made the motion towards a citizens assembly, which certainly I supported and we supported. We've seen in Canada, other provinces, BC, PEI, move towards citizens assemblies. Obviously, from what was recommended to a referendum, and, there doesn't have to be a referendum on electoral reform. I think most of you probably know that. It's not constitutional. But we need to find a path forward, because here's where we are. We don't have it. There's certainly members, Mike, Daniel, others. I have colleagues that are supportive of some form of electoral reform. So we need to create a clear path as to how we can move forward, how we can do it. Again, I'm sitting in government. I've learned that with the greatest respect to the other parties, it's easy to have a long wish list when you have a party with 2, 3, 4 members, say like the Green Party right now, or a party of 30 members like the NDP. So we need to find a way to have our government right now move towards this. And I believe we do that by educating. I believe that I'm a prime example of when this thing went down in 2015, 2016. A lot of MPs were just somewhat indifferent. And a lot of other MPs were either intimidated by change, afraid of what could happen. I mean, the fear mongers out there that, that the Canada's going to blow up if we move towards a proportional representative system. And I believe that we can do that by education, and we do it one MP at a time. We do it one meeting, one town hall, open house, whatever, at a time. And we're calm, we're strategic, and we talk about it. And we give examples of other countries that are very, very successful with the system. And, I would say that we can't afford not to do it, because we see the rise of extremism. We see the rise of hatred, far right ideology really around the world. And a lot of that, in my opinion, comes from the fact that so many people are disenchanted and disenfranchised and don't feel that, like I said earlier, that their vote counts, that they're a part of anything. And, that's why we need to create the right path forward in this. I think Daniel's motion with respect to the Citizens Assembly is an excellent start, but that's only a start. We need to continue to keep our foot on the pedal. What's past is past. It's regrettable, but we still have an opportunity to. I certainly feel, in 2021, we have an opportunity to make that change if we do it working together. And I believe that, again, the pandemic example is a wonderful example of collaboration. Certainly the NDP have proposed, changes to some of our legislation. The Conservative Party has proposed some changes. And when we work together, that's what Canadians want. And that makes for better government. It makes for better policy. So, I'm somewhat of a poster child on the democratic reform side, which really we're not talking about. Yes, I have voted against my government, several times. As the tax changes, I was certainly one of 2 MPs in government that called for an investigation into, SNC and other things. And I believe that, we're elected to represent and elected to speak up. And all of us, in all parties, Green, NDP, Conservative Bloc, we all live the party politics and the whip votes and, you know, a little bit of constraint that way. And, you know, a lot of people don't see that other side of it, where, you know, all of us go to Ottawa, we get into a big system. It's difficult at times to speak up and do what Canadians want us to do. So I believe that, you know, certainly again, to acknowledge Daniel and the leadership he's given on this file. I'm here to help. I'm here to work with all the parties. I do believe that we can form an all-party, you know, caucus on electoral reform and move this forward. And we can talk about that today. And I know certainly Anita would have lots of ideas, but we need to do it the right way, the strategic way to get it done. Because as you know, if we just go off blasting here, blasting there, people get their walls up and we're not going to be able to move this forward. So we need to find the right roadmap. And I want to be part of the solution. And thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. That was super encouraging. I'm sure that was encouraging to a lot of people listening, because that's obviously what we're all looking for, is that opportunity to build support across party lines in a non-threatening way so that we can make some real progress on this file while we still have a minority government, which makes it more possible to make that progress. I wanted to just reiterate a few things that Wayne said, you know, about the reaction to the broken promise. I've had a couple of experiences myself related to that. One thing I've discovered is that even though now it was, what, 4 or 5 years ago, the promise was broken, people have not forgotten. This is going to live in Canadian history for a long time. It had a sort of a long-standing impact. The other thing I've seen around in our supporters, though, Wayne, and I'll sort of, is that people are a lot less angry than they were 2 or 3 years ago. You know, there was that real sense of betrayal. And I mean, some people are still very angry. But really, when I last year, we sent Christmas cards to Justin Trudeau about a citizens assembly. We sent him 10,000 Christmas cards, and I got to read every message in those cards, getting them printed. Santa here. And basically the message was, we want you to do the right thing and leave a legacy for Canadians. So that's really the major sentiment I feel from fair voters. The other thing that I picked out from what Wayne said is just the value of education. The broken promise, ironically, woke a lot of people up to this issue. They weren't thinking about it until it was too late and it was gone. And I really liked what Wayne said about one meeting at a time, one town hall at a time, one conversation at a time. I just had a conversation with an MP who's the other day who's extremely familiar with Fair Vote, been talking to him off and on for 8 years, and said something to him that I felt was pretty basic. And he had no idea. And he said, "Thanks for telling me that, Anita. I didn't know that." So these conversations are really valuable to moving the conversation along. So thank you, Wayne. And I look forward to talking more about that. I am now going to introduce Mike. And full disclosure, I live in Mike Morrice's riding. And I never thought, honestly, I'd live to see the day that Kitchener Centre had a Green MP. And I mean, that's not unrealistic since there's only 2. So thank you, Mike, for being a champion on this file. It's just wonderful. So Mike Morrice was first elected as MP for Kitchener Centre in 2021. He has worked tirelessly leading the shift to a green economy in Waterloo Region and across Canada. He founded Sustainable Waterloo Region in 2008. And in 2013, he founded Green Economy Canada. Both organizations are dedicated to helping businesses and organizations reduce their carbon impact and increase their profits. Mike had PR in his platform in the 2019 election. He had it again in the 2021 election, listed as one of his priority items. And since he's been elected, and you know, obviously it's only been like a month or something, he has continued to advocate and speak out for electoral reform. And he talks all the time about the need to collaborate with people of all different parties across party lines to get things done that people in his community and across Canada want. So I'm excited to introduce Mike, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Anita. Thanks again for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. Thanks to everyone who's joining us. online this afternoon as well. For my part, as you heard from Anita, she and I are both joining you from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral peoples. This is the Haldeman Tract. It's 950,000 acres of land, 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. Specifically, I'm speaking with you from a part of the Haldeman Tract known as Block 2, what is today also known as Kitchener. I think it is important to talk about how this is land that was given to the Six Nations in 1784. And, over the course of time, it was intended to be leased to settlers, but instead was sold as land with full title. And I think it's also worth repeating that across all of the Haldeman Tract, there are actually very few outright legal sales of land, and 90% of the leased land has never been paid for or paid to Six Nations. I also just want to say how what a pleasure it is to be joining you today with Wayne and with Daniel. Wayne, I really appreciate your honesty. I think it's courageous of you to have said some of the things you shared and to be with us this afternoon. And well, as you know, I really appreciate, as we spoke about just a few days ago, that writing first approach, I think, is so important. And Daniel, good to see you this afternoon also. I get to sit next to Daniel in the House of Commons, and so have already been learning so much from him. And one of the things I've seen is what a strong voice Daniel is in Parliament, one of the most well-spoken members. Yeah, I really appreciate the chance to be learning from Daniel. I get to sit between Daniel on one side and Elizabeth May on the other. So it's I guess there's no bad spot, but I think mine's a pretty good one. I'll be brief. I'm seeing so much wonderful chat and a lot of questions coming in. And so I'll just share some of my reflections on why I think proportional representation is so critical. I'll share three reasons. And I guess the first one before I share the three is that it's such a priority for folks in my community. I saw in the chat some conversation about, the level of anger. I can share with you that in my community, there are a lot of people who continue to be very angry with the fact that we haven't moved towards proportional representation despite hundreds of promises being made that way. I'll be honest, I was a bit surprised, when I was knocking on doors and asking, what's most important to you. I didn't expect to have as many people bring up, both in 2019 and in 2021. It's been 6 years since 2015, of course, but the number of people who continued to share with me how disappointed they are that we continue to have a first past the post system in Canada, one of the few places in the world where that continues to be the case. And what a priority it is for my neighbors to see proportional representation advanced. And so that's the overarching reason why I continue and will continue to respectfully look to build bridges to work towards proportional representation. In terms of why I think it's important, here's three reasons. I'm sure folks to this afternoon have a variety of reasons of their own. For me, the first is that it's simply just more democratic. And I think we should be working towards a better form of democracy in this country. As I think Wayne had mentioned, the number of people, and it's not just young people across Kitchener, but people who share with me that their vote doesn't matter. And we know that in our current system, that's true. Every vote should count. It's a pretty basic, simple idea. And we should also have a system where views are represented. And I'll be clear, we could get more into it in the chat as well. That's true for views I agree with as well as those I don't. Just because a person might not agree with those ideas doesn't mean those ideas shouldn't be heard if those are ideas that are represented and views that are held by folks across the country. On climate, though, as one example, the most recent stat I saw, it's around 68% or so of Canadians want to see more ambitious climate action that gets closer to following the science. And yet, of course, we don't have 68% of parliamentarians who are advocating for action on climate that follows the science. And of course, proportional representation is one way that we would see those views represented more clearly in our parliament. The second really important reason is we know when we look at democracies that have embraced a form of proportional representation around the world, that they are more diverse. And that is more diverse. We'd have more women, more gender diversity across the board, a stronger representation of Black, Indigenous, and racialized members of our communities represented. And we know, of course, when our democracies and our elected houses are more diverse, the decisions they make are also stronger. The last that I think is really important, we need to always be talking about, is that we know that any form of proportional representation will lead to more collaborative governments, more respectful. Having now a front row seat for question period on a daily basis in the House, it is disappointing, some of the theatrics that I get to witness. There are some wonderful moments as well, usually in the time that follows question period. But some of those theatrics, the heckling, the name calling, and of course, what we see in local ridings as well across the country, particularly amongst candidates who probably, for the most part, agree with each other, but because of first past the post, are seen to be courting similar voters. All of this, this is a system we've created, a system of viewing other parliamentarians as opposition, as critics, a system that has winner take all. And when you have a system that is designed the way it is, that creates more acrimony and adversarial approaches, well, of course, that leads to some of the outcomes we're seeing. And if we move towards a system with proportional representation, that is one that would then lead to a more respectful discourse, one that I think Canadians would be more proud of, more collaborative decision-making. And of course, we don't even need to just talk academically about this. We could look at governments around the world, even New Zealand, where under PR, they elected a majority of one particular party. That party still invited those from other parties to sit in cabinet. There's still a Green elected MP in New Zealand who's in cabinet, I think as a result of the relationships that have been able to form under a more respectful and collaborative approach. And I think it is possible to disagree with each other without being disagreeable, to be assertive but still respectful. I think it's more difficult under first past the post. And it's one of the reasons that I feel it's so important that we're all advocating for a more proportional approach. So I think I'll pause there again because recognizing the time, but yeah, really looking forward to getting into some of the questions and conversation. Anita, thanks again for having me a part of this.
Thanks for joining us, Mike. It's great to have you on the webinar, and congratulations on being elected in Kitchener Centre. So one thing I wanted to mention that Mike brought up was just that how many constituents he heard about this from. I mean, and that can be a few reasons. One, in my area where Mike and I both live, we are some of the ridings are a couple of the closest swing, usually liberal conservative swing ridings in the country, but also just the impact of having a very active group of people on electoral reform in our community for about 10 years. The kind of people that go out and do 12 festival tables in 1 year, that kind of active in talking to the public and outreaching to people and building that support for electoral reform. So one of the things that I'd asked the guests to talk about, that we will talk more about, is what citizens can do. Here you're seeing the impact of what citizens can do when an MP hears it at the door. And that doesn't happen by accident. It happens by those conversations that Wayne and Daniel and Mike have talked about. The other point that Mike brought up, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about this, is two of them MPs have brought up a relationship between climate action and electoral reform, which I think we could explore a little bit more. So I heard a lot of commonalities between MPs of 3 different parties, and it's wonderful to have them all on this conversation together. So now we are going to take some of your questions. So Brenda has come back, and Brenda, do you have, I see Ted has sent me a first question. You probably have the same one.
Actually, I was going to suggest, just because I see this quite a bit, and it might actually help eliminate a lot of the questions, if for people who weren't at our Citizen Assembly webinar, if you could briefly go over what a Citizen Assembly is and what the problems with the referendum, maybe just in a few sentences. And because I see a lot of questions about, can we have a referendum before the next election? We need a referendum and those kinds of comments.
All right. So this whole subject of referendums, I'll try to do it in a few sentences. For those who really want to dig in, last December, we did a very comprehensive hour-long webinar on why referendums are not a great way to go. And Wayne Long, alluded to that, that this is not in the Constitution. It's not something that requires a referendum. When Justin Trudeau said he didn't support one because they're divisive, I don't always agree with Justin Trudeau, but on that one, I definitely do agree that they are divisive. So we have had now 7 referendums in Canada, referendum or plebiscite on electoral reform. And we have had another one in the United Kingdom on the alternative vote, the winner take all ranked ballot. The reason these fail actually has very little to do with what's on the ballot. That's what the research says. There's now a lot of research since we're at number 8, and they don't fail because people don't support proportional representation or want to see electoral reform. They fail because people are voting for something that's not on the ballot. They're voting based on fear-based messages around loss of local representation, which is a lie, around fears around extremists. They're voting in large part due to partisan cues. So when people don't understand an issue very well, what they do is they take a simple shortcut method and they say, the political leaders that I like most and trust, what are they saying? And we know what they're saying on electoral reform. They're either sitting on their hands and saying nothing, or they're coming out and basically saying, we don't want this. So that's what makes referendums really, really difficult. So Fair Vote Canada for the last 3 or 4 years has been really encouraging the idea of citizens' assemblies. A citizens' assembly is rather like a large jury. So people are randomly selected from across the country, across different demographics, to create a mini public that looks just like Canada, just like how ordinary citizens would decide on this issue if everybody had the time to become educated and in an atmosphere that's free of those partisan messages, and see what they would recommend. So that's why we've been pushing for a national citizens assembly on electoral reform, and why we're so excited to see a citizens assembly coming on Prince Edward Island. So if you go on our YouTube channel, there is hour-long webinar with expert Lawrence Leduc on the research on referendums, and we have many webinars on citizens assemblies on there. Does that do it, Brenda? That was more than a few sentences. Okay, what's our first question?
Well, I think you said Ted had a question.
Yes. Okay, so Ted has sent me a question. Ted is helping me today with our questions in the chat. And this is from Anne Remnant, and she says, what do the guests think are the main reasons for opposition to electoral reform among their fellow MPs? For instance, ignorance, party control, self-interest, laziness, sorry guys, lack of interest from constituents. Can we have our guests join us, all 3 of you again, and whoever wants to tackle that one, go for it.
Well, I mean, I just think that, I can speak firsthand. I think people don't totally understand what PR is or what electoral reform will mean to Canada. I mean, PR is the most commonly used electoral system in the world. Right? Correct, Anita?
Yeah.
So think about that. Like, people, again, it's ignorance. And as I said when I spoke, I'm a classic example of that, who really didn't understand what was at stake, what it would do. It was easy for me to sit back and say, oh, I don't have consensus. My riding was traditionally conservative. And, the conservatives don't want it. And, well, geez, that's half of my riding. So there's no real consensus here. And that was just an easy, for me, it was an easy out. When I dug back in and actually learned it and understood it, and understood the impact you could have with respect to collaboration and stuff. So, again, I think one of the things that holds a lot of us back, and again, I'm speaking for myself here, certainly not Mike or Daniel, but, as MPs, we get torn in 1,000 different directions, and we're on a treadmill that's going, 1,000 miles an hour, and we've got this and we got that, and we have interest groups, and we have projects we're working on, and all those things. And I just don't think that a lot of MPs have taken the time to step back and really learn about it. Oh, Daniel and the NDP are proposing this, so I mean, it can't be, it must be radical. And when you step back and say, no, it's not. And again, I always harken back to New Zealand. Like, the system works. Collaboration works. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on that.
Yep. Okay, so a general lack of awareness among MPs about why this would make a difference and why it should be a higher priority than other things.
That's what I think, yeah.
Okay. Daniel or Mike?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, one of the things I can say, and I count myself fortunate in this regard, is, we talked again about electoral reform in our first caucus meeting of this parliament, and there's a lot of New Democrat MPs who are familiar with the voting reform movement and are very supportive of it. But there are examples. I won't speak to BC or other parts of the country where I'm not from, but when I was growing up, from the time that I was 16 to the time that I was 33, we had an NDP government in Manitoba that never seriously looked at voting reform. Just wasn't on their radar. They never promised it and then didn't deliver. They weren't prepared to promise it. And I think that had a lot to do with winnability and a concern that conservatives and liberals would be able to team up in minority parliaments in Manitoba and block more progressive forms of government. I'm a democratic socialist. I don't make any bones about that. One of the things that my time in Ottawa has reinforced for me, that I think was always true, but that I've really come to articulate in a different way and become more confident in, is that I'm a Democrat first. And I think that the best solutions and the way we're going to build stronger communities and a stronger country is by making sure that we get the democracy part right first. And that means not that we don't have any concerns about what other political views are out there and when they're gaining momentum. And there certainly is some folks on what you might call the far right, but we might also just kind of call more honestly, in certain cases, white supremacy that's finding an explicit political expression in Canada that's unnerving. And I think people are right to feel uncomfortable with that. But our democratic system is about how we mediate those conflicts. And, we're not going to beat those people, as I believe we should, by trying to force them into silence. And part of the strength of their movement and part of why it's gaining the momentum that it has to date, which I'm grateful is not any larger than it is this sense of being not having a way to express themselves, not being heard. And so I think, we want to get the democratic part right. When there are real differences, we need to find a way to mediate them in a peaceful way. And having a better democratic system gives more people the opportunity for their voice to find expression and then to deal with it in a way that is peaceful and where they've had some due process. And the more that we try and design our process based on what voices we want to hear or don't want to hear, the more we're inviting people to find extra political ways or extra democratic ways of imposing their position on their community. And so that's why I think, contrary to those who would argue that a proportional system would allow for more far right political expression, it may, I don't think anyone could give guarantees on this, but I do think that to the extent that expression is here and people who want to see it defeated as a political movement, I think there's no shortcut. We need to take it on. We need to explain why the kind of xenophobia and racism and other things that are so intimately tied to that brand of politics are wrong, and they're wrong for some substantive reasons. I want the right forum to be able to do that. I want a forum that's going to invite more allies, that shows that there's more cross-party agreement. I don't want people to feel that they have to pick one partisan label out of fear for something else that's growing, or pretend that our best strategy is to have everybody join one party and have that party be the one voice against these others. But actually, if we have a broader coalition of voices of people who have legitimate disagreements on other reasons, speaking out against that particular kind of politics, I think that's a stronger case, and we should be welcoming of a voting system that would allow us to have a parliament that can do that effectively. So, definitely hearing the nervousness about those elements, but with eyes wide open, wanting a democratic structure that allows us to adopt what I think would be the winning strategy, and that would bring a lot of other benefits to our democracy in the meantime.
Thank you, Daniel. You said a lot of things I think we should come back to in a follow-up there, but I'm going to ask Mike to respond to Anne's question with your insights about why so many MPs are opposed.
Sure. Briefly, it's not in the best interest of the two main parties in terms of vote counts and seat counts, and that's at a time when we're seeing an increased consolidation of power in the party structures. And so it's inherent to what we're trying to do here, which is actually bring about a stronger democracy. It's again why I just really appreciate having the chance to talk about this across party lines. And I guess on the more optimistic and hopeful side, those pushing for more proportional representation, I've heard that come from people who voted for all parties in the past. And that to me is where we can make progress here. This is not a partisan issue. Like in what reasonable conversation would we end the conversation and say better democracy isn't in all of our best interest? What way could have a greater impact in Parliament than trying to influence better decision making across the board? This is the wish for more wishes. If you get this right, everything else is stronger as a result. And so, I think I guess we get into the technicalities, like what we saw in BC happen in that referendum, right? And we get all tied up in knots on moving away from that very base level fact that more democracy, more diversity. And I mentioned those in the chat who call out the lack of diversity, even amongst the three of us. As a bald white guy, I am taking up space here, and I recognize that and want to be a part of using that space to push for a system that will, by its nature, bring more diversity in. And I think the more we put pressure on our elected officials to recognize that across the country, that there's a movement for this. And the last thing I'll say, because we might have a chance, I'm not sure we'll get a chance to talk about it more, but this conversation around ranked ballots, in Ontario, for example, being seen as this middle ground. Ranked ballots are not proportional representation. We need to be really mindful when we push this conversation that we don't allow ranked ballots to be seen as, like we've seen on climate. It's like, well, it's good enough. We'll build the pipeline here. We'll do carbon pricing here, and we'll feel good about climate. That can't be where this conversation goes. Ranked ballots are not proportional, and we need to be mindful that we keep focused on a more proportional system of government.
I just jump in there if I could, and I just want to pick up on Daniel's point too. It's the problem is with all parties technically. I could go to Darrell Dexter in Nova Scotia, an NDP government that talked about electoral reform, and whoop, I get in. Well, now we're in. Oh, geez, we want to try to secure our stay in, and change will come when more people are educated, more people are comfortable with exactly what it is, and then they need to push their elected officials. Like, that's where the accountability comes from, is the electorate, because you know what? We're all creatures of political pressure also. That's just keeping it real, right? Politicians will move when they feel there's a momentum there, or they're under a little bit of pressure, or it's like, oh, geez, you know what? I've got a lot of calls on this and I'm getting a lot of emails in this. But two sides, you know, like I said earlier, you need to educate people like me, but you also need to educate in the right way the public and make sure the public's not uncomfortable with it and understands what it is. And, you know, I go back again, you know, PR is the #1 electoral system in the world. I'll guarantee you people don't realize that.
Absolutely. I mean, and being next to the United States, I think influences us on a lot of things, right? As long as we're better than them, there's nothing wrong. So we sort of suffer from that compared to being maybe next to Germany or yeah. I wanted to pick up on a few points. There are so many questions and it's hard for me to keep track of all these questions. So I'm just going to cover a couple of topics that came up from all three people here, and then I'm going to go back to questions. Are you good with that, Brenda?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do have a couple of questions lined up if you're.
You have a couple of questions lined up? Okay.
Fine, you go ahead, and then when you're done, we'll get to the questions. And maybe the same questions you have lined up.
Yeah, there was. Okay, so I'm just going to make a really quick clarification because I know there's going to be a bunch of people after the webinar. If I don't say this, are going to be like, Anita. So the whole thing about ranked ballots are not proportional. Just the quick little Fair Vote Canada plug that even though we've sort of lost the language war on this one, ranked ballots are not a system. Proportional systems can use ranked ballots. Including the one that got 58% of the vote in the first BC referendum. So the term ranked ballot has sort of been co-opted by the media and the politicians to mean the winner take all ranked ballot. So when you hear ranked ballot in the media, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about a winner take all system that is as bad or worse than first past the post. But ranked ballots are on their own. Ranked ballot is just the ability to mark 1, 2, 3. Another important topic that came up was just about the fear of extremists. And I'm wondering, I don't know if that is coming up in any of the questions, but it's been a huge, no? Okay, all right.
I didn't see it really, no.
All right, so I think Daniel answered that really, really well, but it's a really difficult, since the rise of the People's Party of Canada, that's really given some pause to people who are afraid of having those more extreme voices in our parliament. And I just sort of want to reinforce what Daniel said, that you know, the way to overcome that is, you know, strong examples of PR around the world, like Wayne has mentioned multiple times, and a coalition of multi-partisan voices calling for PR as better for everyone. And just the examples around the world showing that there's nothing to be afraid of. Whereas there is actually something to be afraid of if we continue with this winner take all system and we have these extremists running around and gaining more and more power, because they will find ways to make their voices heard that aren't quite as nice as somebody having 6 seats in the corner of Parliament. That's experience around the world. Okay, Brenda, do you want to read us one of the questions?
Sure, from Wayne Stefsky from Katanaksa Territory. Sorry, I know I bundled that, but what is the most important action we can take to help you move PR along?
Excellent. Who wants to start?
Well, go ahead, Dave.
Sure. I mean, I think for me, one of the things that's been important and why it was important to me to bring a motion to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee in the last Parliament, and why it's important that it comes there again. And I think this speaks partly to Wayne's point about education of members of Parliament. Like, if we can't keep this on the parliamentary agenda, we're going to lose those opportunities that at the very least allow for a whole bunch of MPs for whom this is not a close personal issue, but something that they got introduced to when they were starting to run for politics. Like, for me, it's one of the reasons why I ran for politics, but I recognize that that's not true for everybody that's in the House of Commons. It's one of the other issues they've had to come to know a little bit about, to the extent that it lands in their lap. And so having things in Parliament that force studies or force votes is a way to have it land in MPs' laps in a way that they can't ignore, especially if there's a vote, because then they think, okay, well, I'm voting on this and I'm hearing from some folks. I also think that these processes in Parliament are one catalyst for organizing in civil society. So then they give organizations like Fair Vote and people who are just concerned about the issue a reason to be in touch with MPs, to talk about these things and to express their support, and a reason to be in touch with their friends and neighbors who aren't necessarily watching what's happening on the parliamentary docket, but can say, hey, I heard about this thing that's happening in Parliament, and I want to talk to you a little bit about it. And if you like what I have to say, maybe you'll consider writing a letter to your MP or sending them an email or whatever, however it is that they choose to be in touch. So the process in Parliament provides opportunities for organizing in the larger society. It puts it in the laps of MPs in ways that are harder to ignore. And so, you know, I'm looking forward to when we get this motion going again at Proc, and I hope that, you know, those parties that supported it last time will be supporting it again. And then that study also becomes something that media look at, you know, because it's one thing to want the media to kind of spontaneously cover the issues of electoral reform. It doesn't always work out the way we want, but I would point to the Special Committee on Electoral Reform as having been one of the reasons why I think electoral reform is an issue has persisted to the extent that it has in the popular consciousness of Canadians, is because there was a lot of education of folks in the media, and then they did a lot of telling stories out to Canadians. So it really brought up the level of public education among politicians, among the media, and among Canadians themselves. And so if a study at Proc can be a reminder of that and an introduction for others, that is positive. To the extent that we could actually get with the motion for Cs, which is a roadmap for how to set up a citizens assembly, then that would be awesome. And if it's reported back to Parliament, there'll be an opportunity for at least a short debate in Parliament and a vote in Parliament, which again puts it in people's laps. So I think, you know, supporting that process, keeping an eye out for it, and being in touch with your local representatives, starting now, in terms of saying how important it is that you want to see your representatives support this happening in Parliament, and then keeping in touch with them throughout the process is certainly something that everyone can do in order to help advance the cause.
Anyone else on what people can do?
I think, like, you have to remember, like for example, everybody that's on here, you know, maybe there's 100 people, 200 people. Like, everyone on here cares about it deeply, is engaged, wants to be involved. But, you know, we call it in Ottawa at times the Ottawa bubble. Like, you know, we're all in there and we think that everybody is totally engaged and involved. But people, like, this has to be a grassroots, because Fair Vote, you know, obviously doesn't, you know, one of my previous jobs, I was in marketing, and, you know, like, Fair Vote Canada doesn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this big campaign across the country to educate people. And, you know, you got to do it. Then you need another wave of advertising, another wave. That's obviously not going to happen. So you really need to start again to educate the common person, because most people, you know what, they're busy with their lives. They're busy with their kids. They go to work, they come home, they watch a little bit of TV, they go to bed, then repeat. And people just aren't engaged. And, you know, what happened was, you know, obviously in 2015-16, sadly, I'll qualify that, sadly, the only people that cared were the people that cared. And the people that cared weren't that many people in the scheme of things across the country. So we really need to build this grassroots, like I said, you know, one person, one meeting at a time, and build some momentum. And until you have momentum, you don't have anything, because you need that groundswell of support where people like Daniel, who's obviously on board, and Keen and Mike and myself, but we need other MPs, other officials, bureaucrats, deputy, whatever, to say, "Ooh, there's a lot of people that want this to happen," and education is the answer. We need to educate people and tell them this isn't something that's going to radically. It's going to make our country better, and that's what we need to continue to push on those levers.
Thank you, Wayne. I just wanted to jump in and say that there are 308 people that are still with us on this webinar. So, and quite a few hundred more who I know will watch the videos.
That's
Thanks,
awesome.
It is
That's great.
awesome. Yeah.
That's really, really good.
Mike, did you want to answer the questions of what citizens can do and respond to any of the things that you've heard from Daniel and Wayne?
Just to build on this point that Wayne, you're making about education, I would move even further towards applying pressure that you mentioned earlier as well. If I think about the 300 people on this call in Kitchener Center, it was about 300 people that were part of the shift over 2 election cycles to move from someone who was not advocating for PR to myself as someone who is. And that's 300 people who affected the votes of about 80,000 people. And so now is the time to organize in a way that constructively applies meaningful pressure in a nonpartisan way to ensure your MP knows the extent to which this is a priority for you and your neighbors in their community. I'll give you an example. When the Prime Minister was asked about electoral reform by the media in the campaign, he got to say in his response that this is the first time it's being asked and we're 36 days in a way that minimized the conversation. Well, if we had been doing more to apply more pressure, that argument moves to the side. And I can say from my time knocking on doors, it came up far more than 1 in every 36 doors. And it really is about the organizing capacity. Like, we're the weekend before the holidays, and you're all making an hour and a half of your time to be talking about electoral reform. That means the 300 people with us are the organizers. And if we've got 300 organizers across the country and a nonprofit who's ready to go, that's to me incredibly inspiring for the kind of influence we could have collectively to put meaningful, constructive pressure to let your MPs across the country know that the status quo is not good enough.
So I'm seeing a few different sort of thoughts come together here. So yes, I hear from all 3 MPs how important it is to build grassroots support and have people visiting their MPs and talking to people and getting more people to visit their MPs so that they feel that pressure and they see that momentum. It also goes back the other way too, because if people don't see there's a realistic chance of any progress, they're not going to spend any time on this. And any campaign can tell you that, you must have some kind of a theory of change, or at least a theory of some progress. So that's why these webinars with you are so important, because it gives people hope and it gives people that energy that if I do something, it could make a difference, rather than just like throwing energy out into the void. And that's what Daniel was saying about having votes that potentially can succeed is super important and motivating for people. Having those points of time to mobilize around is key. I can tell you that from doing this for like 12 years. Those points are really important. So I wanted to ask, I wanted to also reinforce what Wayne said earlier, and he said it a couple times, so I want him to to know that I'm hearing it. The idea of influencing the influencers. It is really hard for a small grassroots group, even though we represent a broad public opinion in favor of PR, to influence and educate 35 million people on voting systems. But some people have more access to influence than others, such as MPs, such as party leaders. So when Trudeau was saying, nobody's, his famous, only a few people care about this thing, right? Which he was on about it again, right? I wasn't hearing it from the NDP or Green leader either. So I'm just putting that out, right? So when leaders mention it, it gives people an incentive. Oh, somebody cares about this. Something could happen on this. So it's a reinforcing cycle where there needs to be pressure bottom up, and there needs to be hope built sort of top down, for lack of a better better way to say that. And that's how we can work together on that. So I wanted to sort of pitch this out actually to maybe all three of you, but I suppose it's a little bit more for Wayne. So one of the things that some of our supporters were really curious about was when the Liberals voted yes for the proc motion. I'll tell you honestly, it caught us by a pleasant surprise. We had done everything we possibly could as a grassroots movement to see this vote succeed, including doing as many MP visits as we could, massive amounts for us of advertising. Like I said, 10,000 Christmas cards. I mean, we had been going nonstop for this, but we were still shocked is a bit high, but when the Liberals on that committee voted yes. What do you all see as the prospect of having that happen again? Because one of the things that was brought up by some people was the cynical view that, well, the only reason they voted yes is because it was right before an election. And I heard that quite a lot. So how much do you think that there needs to be a lot more pressure next time? Or what do you see as the prospects for the proc vote?
I mean, I'm not on proc right now. But, I certainly tell you that Daniel's motion was voted on because it was a good motion. And I mean, I certainly wouldn't disclose all the, backroom and WhatsApp conversations that were going on. But, I think it's safe to say that my colleagues thought it's a good motion and it should go to a citizens assembly. Like, this isn't something that is so outlandish that it's citizens assembly of a cross section of Canadians that are going to come up, with recommendations. Like, it's not that big of an ask, so it should be supported. And I mean, I certainly can't speak to what's going to happen now, but certainly my expectation, I know how I would be voting if I was on proc. And I would expect that a lot of my colleagues would feel the same. So again, I know I heard that too. Oh yeah, easy to pass it. It's right before an election, and you guys. But I'll tell you very clearly, it was a good motion, and it deserved to be passed.
Encouraging to hear. Thank you, Wade. Brenda, do you see more questions?
Okay, I was going to suggest there's a few, but I'm going to combine two. And it says, as an activist, what works and what doesn't in reaching, and maybe we can say educating MPs and politicians in general. So we're trying to, maybe we know our MP knows nothing about PR or doesn't believe that this issue is of interest to them. What is the best way to reach them? What works and what doesn't?
I'll go first here. Look, I'm in my office right now. You can come to my door, and you can come in that door kicking and screaming and demanding, and you can come in and say you're going to do a sit in my office, or you can come in and say, you know what, I'd like to have a good conversation with you. We're going to have a challenging conversation. I'm going to push you, but I'm going to be respectful, and I'm going to, I speak for myself. That's how you get me engaged. You come in with a hammer and you're going to do this, and you're going to stand outside there in Market Square, and you're going to have pickets and all that stuff. It's like, you know what? A lot of MPs will just say, you know what? You want to take that approach? You're not going to get anywhere. Where I believe the other approach is a more strategic, focused, forceful, but that's how you get my attention.
Mike?
I think there's a really important part of this question. I saw it in the chat as well about the concern about all the lobbyists and how much money is in politics. I think something to be mindful of is that any email an MP gets from a lobbyist that's not in their constituency versus a conversation like Wayne just talked about of a neighbor of theirs, a constituent of theirs that is raising a priority of theirs, however they choose to raise it, is far more compelling. even further is the multiplier effect of not just your voice, but when that MP knows that your voice likely represents at least 9 other people, or if you've spent time organizing and have the input of 90 other people when you go into that conversation. I just don't underestimate the influence that you have as a neighbor and a constituent of your MP to be getting their attention, whether you have a well-funded campaign or not. That's what I think your MP is going to be listening most to, in particular, if you can help to communicate the wide mix of support you've got from across your community as well.
Okay. Did
I
I
could
get a
jump in
message
on
from
that if you
Wayne
want,
that
Anita.
I think, okay. All right, I'm okay then. Yeah, if you want to jump in, sorry, I got distracted. Do you want to jump
Sure.
in,
No,
Daniel?
that's fine. I mean, partly just to echo, absolutely. Like, I think people should not underestimate the extent to which hearing from a constituent on something really does matter. It makes the difference for me, certainly, as one of the principal criteria that I use to decide whether I'm going to take a meeting or not. So there's some things that I do on issues when I can, but if I've got constituents that want to meet with me on issues, that's one of the ways that I prioritize which meetings I'm going to take. The other thing that I'll add that just hasn't been said yet is brevity helps, because you're trying to, as an MP, you're hearing it from a lot of people about a lot of different issues. And if the expectation is that an MP is going to have to read through 10 pages of material to get to the punchline, then often they don't have the time in order to be able to do that. So if you are going to send a longer document, make sure that the pertinent information is broken out in an easily digestible format on the front of the first page, because often, and I mean, this is the way they write news stories, right? You don't bury the lead, you put the essential details right at the top, because most people, even reading the newspaper, don't read to the bottom of an article, right? They read the first few paragraphs and they move on. In another life, I did a bit of editing and learned that lesson all too well. So I would just say, be mindful of, particularly in written communication, where you're putting that really important information. And if there's a really amazing takeaway that you think the MP in the short amount of time that they have in order to digest what you're sending them needs to walk away with, don't put it at the end of a 10-page document, put it right on the first page, and that's going to help. That's going to help a lot. And I would just say quickly, to circle back on Wayne's point about, about the motion at PROC. I mean, I think one of the important parts about bringing things back regularly, and this is all part of trying to keep electoral reform on the parliamentary agenda, is to have certain proof points about, about the level of commitment that is out there. And that is one of the other functions of a vote as well, is when there is some doubt about why people voted one way at the end of a parliament or not. When a similar vote, and in this case, a virtually identical motion comes before them, then I think they'll know how people voted last time, and they'll know what it will say about them and about their party if they're not prepared to support the same motion. And that's part of building up that kind of pressure that Mike was talking about. There's different ways that it can be done. Parliament is one place where pressure can be built. It's why it matters to have advocates that are elected to Parliament, in addition to all the great work that happens outside of Parliament to support those folks. But as members of Parliament, we have levers that we can pull in order to help build pressure. And when you have a vote from the last Parliament where there was a clear mandate to move ahead, and then you have a vote again on virtually the same thing, that's a pressure point, and that's how you can get people who might otherwise go the other way. As Wayne was talking about, there's a lot of things to say if you wanted to walk away from the issue, but if you want to build the pressure that makes people feel a sense of sustained commitment over time, putting these kinds of votes in front of them regularly and making them feel uncomfortable about switching is another way to keep more people inside that consensus. If it's 6 years until the next vote, or if it's a long time until the next vote on something, then by that time there's that many more ways to wiggle out. So part of what I am trying to do, and I'm thankful for the allyship of others across party lines in Parliament, is to keep putting this before parliamentarians in a way that they feel they can't ignore, because that's how we're going to keep that pressure up and not let it fizzle.
Okay, so I just want to say that we have less than 5 minutes now. So this is one of those conversations that it's just like so many things were just touched on, and you could just spend an hour on about 5 different things that I heard. So, you know, when Wayne was saying, don't threaten to do a sit-in in my office, come and talk to me or whatever, I was just sort of laughing, because our people are more the kind that are going to bring you the 10-page essay than are going to do a sit-in outside your office. That's the nature of the cause. So we're working on that point form 1-pager that you can enjoy. So I just wanted to reinforce some of the things that were said. So the proc vote is going to be coming up, hopefully in the coming year. I'm hoping that it's after the Ontario election, frankly, because our folks are going to be extremely focused on the Ontario election and the problem we're having with the ranked ballot issue right now, among others. The other thing I heard from people is that conversations with MPs really make, when it's a constituent, really make a difference. And I hear a lot from our people, they're quite concerned about how whipped MPs are and what's the point, my MP is like a party robot anyway. And here I'm hearing from 3 people that those one-on-one conversations really can make an impact on any party, and we could have another separate conversation about that other issue. Yeah, and that it helps MPs to have backup from constituents in their community. So one thing you can do if you're on this webinar is just keep working within your own community to build support for PR that we can take to your MP before the proc vote, because it won't just be the 6 or Liberals and whatever 5, whatever it is on the proc committee that we're lobbying. We will again be lobbying all MPs to try to go and influence their colleagues. So because this matters to people obviously all across Canada, not just whatever constituencies happen to be represented on proc. Okay, so I wanted to thank everyone. Is there anything else I'm missing, Brenda, that really should be touched upon before we sign off for today?
No, there were so many questions. Like you said, we could do another 3 hours of the webinar here and, you know, not satisfy everybody, but terrific turnout and yeah, really.
Yeah, I want to apologize to those who didn't get their question answered. I know there were some people that were probably saying, Anita, have you seen my question? Have you seen my question? We just couldn't get to everything. And it's not that your question isn't really important, and we will try to follow up with you and with our allies across party lines here as much as we can. So I want to thank everybody for taking your time on this Sunday. Mike?
Can I just recognize we got the next generation of Blakey joining us here, which is pretty special. Welcome to our newest guest.
Political dynasty.
When I see an MP with a child, it's just like, I hope, you know, when your child is 18, that they're going to be casting a vote that counts no matter where they live. I hope that we're not all back here in 15 years with, I don't want the next generation of advocate to be your child. Let's win this thing before then.
And maybe more constructive, like I'll offer one last thought, is that we know that democracies around the world are shifting to PR. I hope that's a sense of optimism. Like we're going to get there eventually. Your advocacy is a matter of time. It's about how quickly are we going to get there? And the more pressure that's applied across the country, the more folks like Wayne, like this, to have this kind of courage across party lines, we're going to see more of that as there's more folks that join in here. So yeah, it's just about how quickly we get there. Hopefully long before the youngest Blakey's voting too.
Yeah, it's not if, but when, and we can all help that along by doing everything we can at every opportunity available. All right, thank you everyone for joining us, and I'll
Thanks,
look forward
everyone.
to seeing you guys, you folks, people.
Happy holidays.
Next
Happy
time.
holidays to
Have a
everybody.
great holiday.
Yeah.
Happy
You wanna
holidays.
say bye, Noah?
See you,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.